On January 3, 2026, more than 150 aircraft lifted off from 20 different air bases scattered across the Western Hemisphere. They converged on a single point, Caracas, Venezuela. The operation was called Absolute Resolve, and it was exactly that. Nicolás Maduro, the president of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, was extracted from a fortified compound at Fort Tiuna military base in the early hours of the morning, blindfolded, dressed in a gray tracksuit, placed aboard the USS Iwo Jima, and delivered to a Manhattan federal court 2 days later to face narco-terrorism charges. His wife, Celia Flores, came with him. Trump posted a photograph on Truth Social. The image spread across every screen on Earth within minutes. And somewhere in Beijing, in Moscow, in Tehran, in Pyongyang, very serious people in very serious rooms stared at that photograph and understood that something fundamental had shifted. The operation itself was a demonstration of extraordinary military and intelligence coordination. General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, described how the planning had consumed months. Delta Force units had constructed a full-scale replica of Maduro's compound to rehearse the extraction. The CIA had tracked his movements through a source close to the Venezuelan president. The weather had been the one variable Washington could not control, and when it broke just enough on the night of January 2nd, Trump gave the order at 10:46 p.m. Eastern Time. At 1:01 a.m. Eastern, the apprehension force descended into the compound. By 4:29 a.m., Maduro was aboard a U.S. aircraft carrier. The operation, from presidential authorization to target achieved, took less than 6 hours. It was, for anyone assessing American kinetic capacity, a clinical exhibition. And clinical exhibitions are never just about the immediate objective. They are about the audience. Then came February 28th. Operation Epic Fury. The United States and Israel struck Iran. In the opening salvo of that campaign, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader who had guided the Islamic Republic for 35 years, the theological and political axis around which Iran's entire state architecture revolved, fell, gone from the scene, removed. The language matters here because the language is always doing work, and the work it was doing in those 48 hours was the work of rewriting the rules of international order, or rather of announcing, loudly and with extreme kinetic emphasis, that the rules had already been rewritten and the rest of the world had simply not received the memorandum. U.S. Central Command reported striking more than 3,000 targets in Iran since the operation began. 5 oil sites in and around Tehran were hit in a single night's campaign. Revolutionary Guard fuel storage complexes were struck. Bandar Abbas, the port city on the Strait of Hormuz that served as the southern anchor of the INSTC, was targeted, 2 figures removed from the global stage, 10 weeks apart. Both central allies of China, both central allies of Russia, both load-bearing columns in the architecture of what had been called optimistically and with considerable analytical ambition, the multipolar world order. And now here is the question that I found myself turning over like a stone in my hand, looking at it from every angle. Was this coincidence? Was this opportunism? Or was this strategy deliberate, sequenced, and pointing somewhere that most of the world's commentariat had not yet thought to look? Now we are getting to the most surprising part of this story, because the answer, when you follow the logic of Washington's recent behavior with any seriousness, is that this was neither coincidence nor purely opportunistic improvisation. It was the expression of a doctrine. Not a doctrine written down in any white paper, not one that any senior official would articulate at a press conference, but a doctrine nonetheless, one that had been implicit in American strategic culture for years and was now, under this particular administration, finding its most unrestrained expression. The doctrine, stated simply, was this: the architecture of multipolarity depends on its anchoring states. Remove the anchoring states and the architecture collapses. Venezuela under Maduro was an anchor. Iran under Khamenei was an anchor. And anchors, in Washington's current strategic vocabulary, were targets. To understand why those two countries, in that sequence, you have to go back further than 10 weeks. You have to go back to a map. The kind of map that keeps foreign policy strategists awake at night, because it shows things that daylight conversation prefers not to acknowledge. Venezuela sits atop the largest certified oil reserves on the planet, something in the range of 300 billion barrels. Through its bilateral arrangements with China and Russia, through the shadow fleet of tankers that moved Venezuelan crude around Western sanctions, through its alignment with every anti-dollar initiative that had emerged in the past decade, Venezuela was functioning as a financing mechanism for the multipolar project. Every barrel of Venezuelan oil that reached a Chinese teapot refinery was a barrel that bypassed the dollar-dominated system. Every yuan-denominated transaction, every barter deal with Moscow was a small chisel working at the foundations of the petrodollar order. Maduro was not just a controversial president. He was a node in a network that Washington wanted dismantled. The preparation for Venezuela had been hiding in plain sight for months. In November 2025, Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado had promised at a business meeting in Miami attended by Trump himself to open Venezuela's oil and gas reserves to American investment. In December 2025, the U.S. began seizing sanctioned oil tankers. The Trump administration designated the Maduro government a foreign terrorist organization. More than 4,000 sailors and Marines were positioned near Puerto Rico. The coercion architecture was assembled piece by piece, in full view, and the message it was sending to every other state in the Western Hemisphere was unmistakable. The Monroe Doctrine had returned, and it had new teeth. Iran was something else entirely. Iran was the keystone. Trace the lines of the International North-South Transport Corridor, the INSTC, on any serious geopolitical map. This was supposed to be the new Silk Road's most ambitious artery, a route running from Russian ports on the Baltic, down through the Caucasus, across the Caspian, into northern Iran, south to the port of Bandar Abbas on the Strait of Hormuz, and onward to Indian ports on the western coast. In January 2026, just weeks before Operation Epic Fury, the INSTC had seen its record month of container traffic. The first regular container trains were linking the Moscow region directly to Bandar Abbas. Russia was finding a way to reach Indian markets that bypassed every Western-controlled choke point. China had invested heavily in Iranian infrastructure through the Belt and Road Initiative. Iran also served as a crucial node in BRI, offering a land-based alternative to the Malacca dilemma. Tehran was the hinge on which the entire Eurasian connectivity project turned. And then Bandar Abbas was struck, and Khamenei fell, and the hinge came off the door. The detail that nobody talks about, but that decides the game, is this. These were not two separate stories. They were chapters in the same book. Consider the timing with the granular attention it deserves. Operation Absolute Resolve in Venezuela happened on January 3rd. The USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, which had been deployed to the Caribbean during the Venezuela operation, was subsequently redeployed to support the Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group in the Middle East buildup, repositioned by February 12th. The same naval infrastructure that executed one operation was being repositioned for the next within weeks. When you read the statements from the Trump administration during those 10 weeks about narco-terrorism in Venezuela, about nuclear enrichment in Iran, about protecting American interests, about taking on drug traffickers and rogue regimes, you began to hear, underneath the official justifications, the sound of a strategic ledger being balanced. Two liabilities of the multipolar order assessed and addressed in sequence. Trump said after the Venezuela operation that the United States would run the country until a safe and judicious transition. He said it with the particular confidence of a man who does not expect to be contradicted. When Iran's ambassador to China appeared on Phoenix TV in Beijing and said that Iran would retaliate and could strike the continental United States if possible, it read less as credible military threat and more as the desperate improvisation of a state whose strategic depth had been catastrophically degraded in a matter of hours. Because that was what Operation Epic Fury had also done. It had not merely removed Khamenei from the scene. It had struck 5 oil sites in and around Tehran. It had targeted the Revolutionary Guard fuel storage complexes. It had hit Bandar Abbas. It had, in a single sustained campaign, attempted to dismantle the physical infrastructure of Iranian strategic power at its most critical nodes. The real breaking point starts right here, because now we have to talk about the responses, or rather the non-responses, of the two great powers that had positioned themselves as the architects and guarantors of the multipolar order. China and Russia had built their entire strategic narrative around the idea that they were reliable partners, that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meant something, that BRICS meant something, that the 25-year Iran-China cooperation agreement signed in the final months of 2025 meant something, that the 20-year Russia-Iran Comprehensive Strategic Partnership meant something. China had elevated Iran's global standing by bringing it into BRICS and the SCO. Chinese firms had supplied technology that deepened Iran's infrastructure. Moscow had signed comprehensive strategic documents. Russian and Chinese warships had conducted joint naval exercises in the Strait of Hormuz under the banner of the Maritime Security Belt. And then, when the test came, the actual unambiguous kinetic test, both Beijing and Moscow responded with strongly worded statements and urgent phone calls. Wang Yi, China's foreign minister, told his Israeli counterpart to end the attacks. He called for a ceasefire. He said China advocated resolving issues through dialogue and consultation. Lavrov held press conferences and warned about nuclear proliferation. Both countries supported an emergency United Nations Security Council meeting. Both countries issued condemnations. And then, nothing. No material support, no military assistance, no concrete action to defend a partner that had been central to their Eurasian strategic architecture for years. Gabriel Wildau at the advisory firm Teneo put it with stark precision. China's statement was strongly condemnatory, but beyond this rhetoric, I don't see China's government taking concrete action to support Tehran. Preserving détente with the United States remained a strategic priority for Beijing. The Xi-Trump summit, planned for later in the month, would go ahead as planned. China had too much invested in the bilateral relationship with Washington to risk it for Tehran, and Russia, after 4 years of grinding conflict in Ukraine, had its military resources fully committed. Moscow was watching with what analysts described as a wait-and-see approach, a diplomatic phrase for saying that Russia could not do anything meaningful and chose to dress that incapacity in the language of strategic patience. There is a word for what happened when Iran needed its partners and its partners offered only rhetoric. The word is abandonment. And abandonment in geopolitics is not merely an emotional category. It is a structural revelation. It reveals the actual load-bearing capacity of an alliance. What the events of February and March 2026 revealed was that the Russia-China-Iran triangle, for all its rhetorical power, for all the joint naval exercises in the Strait of Hormuz, for all the summit photographs and strategic partnership agreements, was structurally incapable of defending its weakest node when the pressure became kinetic. And the detail nobody talks about, but that decides the game, is this. Washington knew that. Washington was counting on it. The strategic logic becomes visible when you examine what China actually did during the crisis. Beijing banned the export of rare earth elements for military use, a calibrated move, meaningful enough to be noticed, limited enough not to trigger escalation. Meanwhile, Chinese tankers continued to navigate the Strait of Hormuz. The Liberia-flagged Sino-Ocean, owned and managed by Chinese companies, passed through the strait on March 7th after loading cargo in the UAE 2 days earlier. The commerce continued. The strategic partnership produced press statements. The difference between those two facts told you everything about the hierarchy of Chinese priorities. Nearly all of Iran's crude exports had been flowing to China, accounting for roughly 13% of China's total seaborne crude intake. Beijing was absorbing the supply disruption, diversifying through Gulf Cooperation Council states, and calculating that the long-term cost of confronting Washington over Tehran was greater than the short-term cost of the supply adjustment. Russia's position was equally revealing. For Moscow, Iran had been the indispensable gateway for the INSTC. record traffic in January 2026. Then, in a matter of days, Bandar Abbas was struck and Iranian infrastructure was degraded in ways that threatened to collapse years of investment in Eurasian connectivity. Russia condemned the strikes, called for a ceasefire, engaged in diplomatic telephone calls with everyone from Lavrov to Oman's foreign minister Badr al-Busaidi, and then continued to calculate with the cold arithmetic of a state whose military was overstretched and whose economy was under sustained sanctions pressure that direct confrontation with the United States was not an option. The irony was almost operatic. Russia was watching its most important southern connectivity corridor being dismantled in real time and could not do anything about it because its power was entirely consumed by a war in Ukraine that Washington had helped sustain. Now we are getting to the most surprising part of this story. Because while Washington was projecting power with remarkable efficiency, the costs were beginning to circulate back toward the metropole. Brent crude crossed $100 per barrel for the first time since 2022. It touched $119.50 before retreating to around $105. G7 finance ministers held emergency meetings. French President Emmanuel Macron was calling for the G7 to release emergency oil reserves. The Hormuz closure was adding $7 to $10 per barrel to the global oil price, spiking bond yields and pressuring equity markets. Qatar had suspended all air navigation indefinitely. Qatar Airways grounded all flights. Schools moved to remote learning. A Bahraini desalination plant was struck by an Iranian drone. The U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet headquarters in Jaffa was targeted by Iranian missiles multiple times. 8 U.S. service members were confirmed lost in the Gulf region. The costs of empire, as they always do, were beginning to circulate back toward the center, and Lavrov made a point that deserved far more attention than it received in the cascade of breaking news. The Russian foreign minister said that the logical consequence of the U.S. and Israeli actions could be that forces would emerge in Iran in favor of acquiring a nuclear weapon. Because the US doesn't attack those who have nuclear bombs, he said. He was not wrong. And the lesson was not being learned only in Tehran. It was being learned in every capital that did not currently possess a nuclear deterrent. North Korea had been watching every development with the particular attentiveness of a state whose entire survival doctrine rested on the argument that nuclear deterrence was the only reliable protection against the kind of treatment that Venezuela and Iran had received. Saudi Arabia had been watching and drawing its own calculations. Turkey had been watching. The operation designed to prevent nuclear proliferation had, with a dark irony that historians would note for generations, created the most powerful advertisement for nuclear acquisition that the 21st century had yet produced. The NPT regime had not survived the week intact. The real breaking point starts right here. And then there was BRICS. The bloc had cracked in ways the multipolar optimists had been reluctant to anticipate. When Iran launched a barrage of drones and missiles at the United Arab Emirates and the fellow BRICS member, it was the first time that one member of that organization had fired on another. The UAE detected 238 Iranian missiles and over 1,400 drones launched at its territory in the first week of the conflict. The idealized image of a cohesive global South counterweight to the Western-dominated G7 dissolved under the pressure of a real military conflict in a way that, in retrospect, anyone who had been paying close attention to the bloc's internal contradictions should have anticipated. India, the current chair of BRICS, declined to criticize the United States. Prime Minister Narendra Modi had visited Israel just days before the conflict began, announced a special strategic partnership, and had his own calculations to make about the Trump administration's tariff regime. South Africa was visibly reassessing its foreign policy priorities. The Gulf BRICS members were under Iranian fire. The bloc had no mutual defense clauses, no integrated military command, no mechanism for collective deterrence. It was what the Johannesburg Center for Risk Analysis called a paper tiger when tested against kinetic pressure. But the story was not simply one of American triumph and multipolar collapse. Because there is a difference between winning the battle and winning the war, and the Trump administration's approach to both Venezuela and Iran was generating costs that the headlines of immediate victory were obscuring. The Venezuela operation had been condemned by numerous countries, including some American allies. A UN Secretary General spokesperson had called it a dangerous precedent. Colombia's leftist president, Gustavo Petro, had mobilized security forces and warned about responding to any similar intervention on Colombian soil. Tens of thousands of Cubans had gathered outside the U.S. Embassy in Havana. Nicaraguan authorities had moved against opposition figures. The Western Hemisphere, which Washington had imagined would welcome the removal of Maduro, was in significant portions alarmed by the methodology, even where it was indifferent to the man. Now we are getting to the most surprising part of this story. Let us step back now and look at the wide-angle picture, because the pattern that the 10 weeks from January 3rd to the end of February had inscribed on the map of global power was striking in its coherence and in what it was pointing toward next. Because if Venezuela and Iran were the first two moves in a strategy designed to dismantle the infrastructure of multipolarity, then the network had more nodes. Cuba remained, Nicaragua remained, Bolivia remained. The governments of Mali, of Niger, of Burkina Faso, all the states that had been deepening ties with Russia while creating distance from Western institutions, were watching and drawing their own conclusions. The CNN framing captured the strategic arithmetic with uncommon directness. The US just took out two China-friendly leaders in 2 months. Why has Beijing done very little about it? The question answered itself, but the answer was not permanent. It was conditional. China's most significant concrete response to the Iran conflict was the rare earth export ban. That, and the fact that Beijing was quietly accelerating its own domestic weapons production capacity, its own satellite navigation independence, its own financial infrastructure for conducting transactions outside the SWIFT system. The visible inaction in the face of Iran's pressure was not passivity. It was the strategic patience of a power that had identified the long game and was refusing to be provoked into fighting the short one on Washington's terms and timeline. Every Chinese rare earth that did not reach an American weapons production line was a future constraint on Washington's ability to repeat the Venezuela-Iran playbook. The chess was being played in a different register. The real breaking point starts right here. There is a historical echo in all of this that I kept hearing, sitting with the coffee cooling in front of me and the maps spread across the table. The echo was of Rome in the 3rd century, when the legions were still winning their battles and the treasury was being drained by the cost of winning them. The echo was of the later Abbasids, who could still project enough power to intimidate, but no longer enough to integrate, to build, to hold the vast connectivity of the civilization they had inherited. The echo was of every empire that had reached the moment when the gap between its military capacity and its political imagination began to widen in ways that no number of successful operations could close, because operations have costs, and the costs of empire, unlike its glories, are paid not in headlines but in the slow erosion of the material and moral foundations on which power ultimately rests. The Trump administration framed both operations in the language of law enforcement. Maduro was a narco-terrorist facing charges in a Manhattan federal court. The Iran operation was, in the official framing, a mission to prevent nuclear proliferation. These were domestic political framings designed for American audiences, designed to fit within legal frameworks that the administration was simultaneously straining to accommodate. Trump's invocation of inherent constitutional authority for the Venezuela operation, his statement that he didn't have the yips with respect to boots on the ground in Iran, these were the pronouncements of an executive power operating with a sense of its own mandate that had decoupled substantially from the constraints of international law or multilateral legitimacy. And that decoupling was itself the message. Because what every government in the world that was not already a firm American ally was processing in the spring of 2026 was not primarily the operational details of two military actions. It was the implication of those actions for their own futures. The implicit guarantee that conventional sovereignty had provided under the post-1945 order that a sitting head of state, however odious to Washington, would not be extracted from their capital by Delta Force had been voided. The protection that nuclear deterrence provided had been made viscerally clear by contrast, and the reliability of the multipolar alternative as a security framework had been tested and found, in its current form, inadequate. These three conclusions, taken together, pointed toward a world that was neither the liberal international order nor the multipolar alternative, but something more volatile and less institutionalized than either. A world in which the strong exercised power without institutional mediation, in which the medium powers were calculating with furious intensity how to accumulate the specific capabilities, nuclear, financial, technological, diplomatic, that could make them too costly to coerce, and in which the global south was being forced to choose between dependence and self-reliance with a clarity that all the strategic ambiguity of the previous decade had permitted them to avoid. Two allies removed in 10 weeks, a doctrine made visible, a network disrupted but not destroyed, a precedent set that no one knew how to answer and everyone knew they eventually had to address. And somewhere in the background, the slow, patient work of building the next architecture, the one being drafted in military planning rooms and central bank meetings and technology ministries across the non-Western world in the weeks after Operation Epic Fury, with the memory of Caracas and Tehran as its founding documents. The board had been cleared of two pieces. The game was still being played, and the players who remained were learning at considerable cost what kind of game it actually was. The question being asked in every serious strategic conversation in the world was no longer whether the old order had ended. It was who had the patience, the resources, and the institutional imagination to build what came next, and whether they would get the time to build it before the next round of moves arrived. Because if history teaches anything, it is that empires do not fall in a single campaign. They fall in the accumulation of campaigns, in the gap between what they can do with their military and what they can sustain with their treasury, their alliances, their political cohesion, and the stories they tell about themselves. Washington had demonstrated in 10 extraordinary weeks the outer limits of what kinetic power could achieve. The more interesting question, the one that would take years, not weeks, to answer, was whether those limits were a ceiling or a foundation